Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully your lunch is all good. I'm Rebecca Payne. I work with ICF, and I'm going to be presenting to you a program that we've been developing for a local municipality in San Diego, the City of Chula Vista. So we've been working since 2020 on developing an alternative compliance system to provide stormwater pollutant control credits under their MS4 regional permit through the implementation of stream restoration. So as an overview, there are three different components of this program. The initial component is that we developed a water quality equivalency to determine the benefit for pollutant control from the stream restoration design. The second component is the framework for an in-lieu fee program, and then the third component is that a priority development project, which is defined in the MS4 permit, and is essentially a development project that follows LID and other green infrastructure development protocols as described in the permit, can also propose their own alternative compliance project. A little additional history on this program that we're developing is it's allowed under the MS4 permit, but it has not been utilized. So it's been in the permit since I believe 2013 as an option, and everyone's kind of been waiting for it to happen. The City of San Diego worked on developing a similar program, but there was pushback from some local nonprofits against the program that they were proposing. And so the City of Chula Vista is taking this forward as a pilot program. It is funded, the development of this program is funded by an SB2 housing grant, which is a California state funding source. So quickly going over the in-lieu fee program, it will be managed by the City of Chula Vista, and the city itself has, as many local municipalities do, they have limited funding and staffing resources, so they do want to do implementation through public-private partnerships when available, and the limitations on those from the resource agencies, which is the Regional Water Quality Control Board, which is under our state water agency. So the limitations are that the city has oversight and responsibility over a good portion of the program, even if it's developed in partnership with a private developer. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make sure I'm looking at the right slides. So the program is specific to the City of Chula Vista. The regional permit covers most of the San Diego area, but because this is a pilot program, it is limited strictly to the bounds of the City of Chula Vista, not even extending to the additional watershed that's covered within the program, but outside of the borders of the city. We made this choice largely because of the approval process. Had we gone outside of the extent of the City of Chula Vista, it would have taken a much higher level of approval. So working with the regional board and the city, the request was to keep it within the city boundaries to have it function as a pilot project for other municipalities to then take a look and see how it worked, and then others are able to choose whether or not to adopt a similar program for themselves. This program is only available to the priority development projects that I mentioned before, the PDPs, which are utilizing green infrastructure. And this does only cover the pollutant control portion, so there is still a first flush requirement for on-site treatment. But in general, what this will provide is off-site treatment for pollutant control outside of that first flush. Why this is really important in the City of Chula Vista is it's an area that has a lot of development and not a lot of space. And so they're looking to do a lot of infill development as well as minimizing their development footprint, but there are requirements in their stormwater permit that all of the stormwater generated on site be treated prior to it going to the receiving body. So what this program will allow them to do is to do off-site alternative compliance. And there are other alternative compliance programs that use standard BMPs. Those typically end up with large stormwater detention basins, which, while functional, don't really look great on the landscape. They don't provide any additional benefits for habitat, and it's not really, a good portion of your community. The other factor that's involved in Chula Vista is it is a generally economically disadvantaged community. Most or all of the city falls within that qualification. So this is really something that, the city felt was important to provide, and we wanted to give them the opportunity to really improve their natural resources, to improve the overall condition of the city by providing those additional natural resources that people can recreate within or be around, provide general benefits to them as well as to the species. There are endangered species in the area. This program is focused on water quality, but as professionals working on this, we want the world to be a better place, and we see that happening through stream restoration, and we want those streams to be restored. There are also a number of streams in this area, because the area, and I understand people on the East Coast have had development a lot longer, but there's been development in this area for the last 100, 150 years, and up until 2010 or so, there wasn't any requirement or really option, no incentive to treat the stormwater prior to it leaving the site. And so there's a lot of those historic developmental impacts that just kind of, urban drool into the streams. There's been a lot of degradation in the streams in Chula Vista as well as a number of other areas within the state. And so there's really a lot of opportunity to remove pollutants from the system through improving the function of the system. So that's really what we're trying to do, is raise the functions and values provided by these streams and provide those pollutant control credits by which will address both the new development pollutant control credits while also remediating those previously developed areas by improving the overall quality of the system. There's some other, fun facts about the program. In general, it will require long-term maintenance and monitoring. It's not a one and done. We are, as these credits are providing permanent mitigation for the impacts, we're also requiring permanent protection. A lot of that, the plan is generally to have it go under the city's protection through a conservation easement or other easement where the city is then either managing or otherwise responsible for the condition, but that can be left up to the project as it's developed on its own. Credit release schedules will be drafted so that the credits, a big bulk of the credits initially go into place when the project is constructed, which is tied to where we see the bulk of credits coming from in our water quality equivalency formula, which you'll see in a minute. Then as those projects meet success criteria, because as it is a habitat restoration project, no one expects it to be fully functioning on day one. We do need that vegetation to have that time to grow. So over the success monitoring period, additional credits will be released according to the credit release schedule. We were looking at this in a lot of ways, even though it's not a 404 program, it is 402 under the NPDES, the MS4 permit. We were mimicking the in lieu fee structure. So the city is looking for funds to pay in to provide that restoration. They do have a time limit on when those projects need to be in the ground. It's a lot more generous than you get under the in lieu fee. I think it's 4 years from the initial certificate of occupancy for the development project, which is really once they've had all their permits, everything's approved. There's 4 years for that mitigation credit, that ACP credit to go into place. So that is a lot of extra time, and then there is a temporal component if there is that lag between when when the certificate of occupancy is issued and when that credit is actually in place. So very similar to the in lieu fee under 404, but with some key differences. The other key difference I want you to think about as we're going through and as I get into the formula is the design criteria is different because this is focused on stormwater as opposed to on 404. And one thing that is not really addressed on this slide talking about the program is, obviously there's a co-location where this is done in a stream. So those are 404 resources. The entire city, there's nothing that's isolated within the city under 404 regs. So there is the opportunity also for these credits to be joined in with a 404 bank. And we provided guidance in the program document to address how those credits could either be stacked or excluded from each other. Because when you're thinking about a wetland mitigation credit, and this is something that we thought about a lot, when you're thinking about a wetland mitigation credit, that's really encompassing the full suite of functions and values that that wetland is providing. And as you have an impact, and most of our impacts are fully removing that wetland, so when you are replacing it, you're not just replacing, everything but the water quality. So we couldn't split those out, and we didn't want to. So we're recognizing that a 404 credit is providing that full suite of functions and values, and these credits would be outside of that. So you couldn't sell them both. We're not unstacking, if you're familiar with that term. But there is that opportunity, and as you'll see when we get into the water quality equivalency, how the credits are developed under this, there is opportunity for credits to be outside of the wetland area, so for them to work hand in hand with a bank and be an additional source of revenue and credits within a banking system. I think I covered all of that. So in terms of how a PDP would use the ACP program, it can either purchase credits that are in the in-lieu fee, or it can develop its own ACP project using the water quality equivalency guidance. These are the compliance documents that we have drafted. They're called compliance documents because it is a stormwater program. That's another thing to keep in mind. This is stormwater, so we're looking at it in a different light than standard habitat restoration. So we have our program document that outlines how the entire program functions together. We also have 2 technical memos, one identifying how that water quality equivalency was put together and how it was determined how each factor would work together, as well as how to use it and how to do the calculations to get your water quality equivalency for your ACP project. So this is actually this was the big thing that was missing, is the equation to find your equivalency for your pollutant control credits from that stream restoration project. And so this is the water quality equivalency guidance document that's already existing for the San Diego regional permit area. And you can see that, they have, there it is, there's a lot of things for BMP. So alternative compliance is already available for BMPs. And just in case I wasn't really clear on it before, alternative compliance generally means off-site. So you're looking at providing a regional pollutant control or hydromodification control measure outside of the project footprint, which allows that development to be more dense within the project area, but the compliance still being met, so the requirements of the permit still being met. So what really is missing is everything down here under the NSMPs, which is Natural Systems Management Projects. We looked at what opportunities were available. This was a pilot project with not unlimited funding. So we really felt that based on the existing scientific research, examples in other states, that the best opportunity for benefit is under stream rehabilitation. There is the opportunity for the city or another municipality to go back and do a similar effort for land restoration or land preservation. However, we really didn't, for a number of reasons, feel like that was going to be the biggest bang for the buck, and we wanted to show success. So what we have developed under this program is the water quality equivalency for that stream rehabilitation category. I do want to note that for hydromodification, that is already available. So while it is included and addressed under the program for the in-lieu fee, we did not do any calculations, any additional development of hydromodification. So we left that with what had already been developed and is included in this guidance document. So it's done on a very different way than the pollutant control is, but it was already there, so we didn't need it. Oh, by the way, if you have questions as I'm going, please stop me. I'm happy to address things. We'll go through a lot of different topics on this, so I want to make sure I'm addressing them as they come up. This is being recorded, so you do need to wait for the mic if you do have questions. So what we're really looking for, focusing on that stream rehabilitation, is ways to provide that restoration. So stabilization, reaccessing that floodplain for areas that are entrenched, that don't have access to the floodplain, having those buffers that are providing the benefit to the system, providing some water quality benefit from having buffers preserved as natural habitats, as well as improving the biotic structure, the riparian habitat, and general things that you think of when you think of rehabilitation. So this is kind of the main way that credits are generated under the program, is by providing, so when I mentioned that we're looking at a different design flow than you would necessarily look at for a ecological mitigation 404 restoration, our design flow is substantially different. So based on the permit requirements, the design flow that this equation and this program is developed for is the 85th percentile 24-hour storm event. So it's looking at really, that's where those water quality impacts are coming from under stormwater, so that's what we're designing for. And a lot of what we're looking at is how can we get the greatest benefit for that design flow. So what we're looking at, you see at the top an entrenched stream. I don't love this image that we developed on the bottom in terms of this context, but what we're looking at is really increasing the surface area, and not necessarily surface area, but increasing the different moisture regimes, the access to the floodplain, and the area that that creek is able to flow over. Again, interaction with the floodplain, interaction with the buffer, and providing the additional inundation area is what we call it, because that's a big source of pollutant control under the stormwater system. So as we're working within the stormwater world, stormwater, if you don't work in that world, it is largely driven by engineers. They do not generally work in the ecology world. Some of them do. We actually had a great engineering team that was on our team for developing this, who does a lot of ecological restoration. Great partnership, loved working with them. And they also recognize that as we want this to be successful in the stormwater world, we need to make this as familiar as possible to the rest of the stormwater community. So this is the existing WQE, the water quality equivalency for the BMPs in the San Diego region. And it's really looking at the benefit provided by the BMP that is used for alternative compliance. So the before condition, the after condition, the treatment that is being provided, and that's all based on stormwater metrics that they've developed. I'm showing you this because as we move forward and go through, you'll see that our formula looks very similar to that, and we kept it in the same format to keep it familiar to the stormwater community. So the three different terms that we felt were important to include in our water quality equivalency, where we really felt like the most treatment would be coming from, is retention of water, so how much water is retained on the site, the treatment that is provided by that, as well as sedimentation. So obviously sediment is a big pollutant, and it carries a lot of other pollutants with it. So how much sediment can be prevented from leaving the site, as well as a vegetation and biological ecological component. So this is the formula that we've developed. And you can see, again, it's looking at prior condition and post-condition. We're looking at the change in water that's coming through within the inundation area, and that's, again, based on that 85th percentile storm. We're also looking at the efficacy of each of these in each of those terms. So when we're looking at, I'll go through each of them separately, but we're looking at the efficacy of the pollutant removal under each term, as well as the change in volume or the change in condition. So we have like I said earlier, the retention, the sediment, and then the vegetation and biological condition. And then we're going through, you can see, obviously we have definitions for all of these, and the ecological condition factor, I'll be talking about how we also address that, and if you're familiar with it, that's based on the California Rapid Assessment Methodology for wetland condition. And so in this case, that's been developed with the EPA, the State Water Resources Control Board, other agencies. It's been very well vetted and has, importantly, looked at what change in condition under that assessment methodology gives you a actual change in condition on the site. So there are other assessment methodologies where you're looking at it and your score may change, but there's there's not necessarily an assessment of a change in 0.01 or a change in 1 actually represents a physical change in condition on the site. And CRAM does provide that for us, as well as being a fairly rapid method. I've also been involved in the technical committee for CRAM since 2011, and I think it's a very good method, and it provides a lot of benefit. So moving on, when we're looking at retention, this is looking at how much water is staying on the site. So there's a lot of information on this. This is based very closely to how it's done in the BMP world. and we kept it based on that, again, for familiarity to the stormwater world. This does also have a land use factor that goes into it, so it's not just looking at the quantity of water that's coming into the site, but of the land uses within the immediate watershed that are supplying the water, and that identifies the pollutant, the pollutants that are coming into the site. So within the region as well as the city, there are pollutant land use factors for each land use type that identify the assumed quantity and quality, or quantity and type of pollutant that comes off of each of those land uses. And the other thing that I want to note about retention, which we'll see, oops, I thought it was on that slide. Retention comes in two forms. It comes from both evapotranspiration as well as infiltration. And this is something that as an ecologist, I had to accept in the stormwater world. When you evapotranspirate or infiltrate, you remove 100% of the pollutants in that water that left, because that water is gone, so it doesn't have pollutants. And that's what they have that assumption of. I'm with you, Brian. So that's, I wanted to point that out. That is from the stormwater world to keep things consistent with them, and because that's a standard method that they use. So sedimentation is, again, looking at how much sediment can we retain on site, how much of that erosion can we stop, so we're preventing that sediment from going into the system. I mentioned before that we didn't address hydromodification, and I want to address it a little bit here. So one of the components of hydromodification is, that's when you're looking at, you've got increased flows coming in, and of course hydromodification can lead to additional erosion and then sedimentation. So that does also need to be addressed by the priority development sites, so to make sure that they're not causing additional erosion. We're looking at really the stream restoration and how we can improve the function of the stream to prevent the erosion from happening within the restoration site. The other part of hydromodification that is not addressed under this program and under the permit can't be addressed is based on the location of the development site, because there's a recognition that there are coarse sediments that are desirable in the stream, and so the development sites can't be located within their critical coarse sediment areas, so that those coarse sediments can make it into the system, provide the sediment that you want for habitat, as well as making it down into San Diego Bay. So now we get to my favorite part of the equation, the vegetation component. So there's a couple of different portions of the vegetation component we looked at. When you're in a stream restoration area, there's a few different kinds of vegetation you can have. It's not just monotypic. We don't want it to be monotypic. You have your riparian vegetation. You can also have your forbs, grasses, understory that occur on the banks or potentially within your ordinary high water mark and your actual stream. So we recognize that that vegetation on its own is providing a pollutant control benefit. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, so we looked at a lot of different studies that have looked exactly at, how much is this vegetation removing pollutants from the system. And we determined, so based on the research, we decided that within 12 inches is what we started out with of height within your inundation area. So you've got water coming through, 12 inches of the water column. We felt that that was the effective height of the vegetation. Through a lot of discourse with the water board, they actually requested that we increase that height to 18 inches. So when you're looking at your inundation area, 18 inches of it is getting benefit of pollutant removal from the vegetation. We talked about during development of the equation whether or not we really wanted to separate out based on vegetation types that were in the project. Do we separate it out by forest, by shrubs, by basically height classes, so grasses, forbs. Ultimately, for ease of use, we decided to lump them all together, and I'll get to that in a minute because we did a little other lumping too. And the main reason that we did this was both for ease of use as well as to be conservative in our values. We didn't want to be over-mapping, over-prescribing the benefit. We want to make sure that when we're showing that that pollutant control is achieved, that we are not overstating the benefit that's being provided. So we really tried to be conservative in what we were stating the benefit would be. I know I talk a lot and I talk fast, so I want to take a minute. Are people pretty? The mic's coming to you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I just have a quick clarifying question.
Yeah.
The 12 or 18 inches refer to vegetation heights in the water? Water
Within
depth?
the inundation area.
So the water depth is what you're after, not the vegetation depth, the vegetation
Both.
heights.
Yeah, so the vegetation can be more than 18 inches, but a vegetated area that has 18 inches of flow over it.
So riparian areas in this component are not considered, riparian areas that are upland.
They are if they're within the inundation area. So they can be, yes.
How is the inundation area calculated? Is that maximum inundation, average over the year? I mean, I'm sure you have flow differences.
So I tried very hard to force an integral into the equation. I took a lot of calculus in college, and I was like, we are going to do this, and I did not win. So really what we're looking at is we're looking at the 24-hour storm event. Had I brought my engineer with you, who did a lot of support on the development of this, she could have explained exactly how it worked. I am not an engineer, but we looked at a specific event with specific intervals, and so that gave us the level that the inundation area would be. We did some case studies, which I realized I should have included in this to show you, but I took them out for brevity because I didn't think I had enough time to talk about them. So when we're modeling, we did HEC models to show what that storm event would look like, and looked at that specific flow event. We did not do it for the full 24-hour period. We did it for a certain, like a 1-hour time period, I think, to get that extent. It is, the manuals I showed, the technical documents are actually public. They're on the City of Chula Vista site. You have to dig a little bit, but they are there. And then I'll get to the end where we are in the approval process, but hopefully we'll be approved in the next couple months, and then everything will be public through the water board as well. Yeah, Brian?
Are these studies based on the sources you had? Most of the time I've seen it, or when I've look into the studies for buffer usage and vegetation removal, it's about lateral sources, and it's the width of the vegetation, and I've never thought of it as being related to the depth of inundation, and that being a factor. And so do any of those studies focus on sites where they're fully inundating it, and they're talking about removal from upstream sources as opposed to lateral?
Yes. Okay. And one specifically that I'll point out is let's see if I can, oops, I'm hitting the wrong button. There we go. This CCWG source is looking specifically at pollutant retention within wetlands flowing through. So that's a fairly good analogous study for what we were doing. It's in Central California, Moss Landing area, in the Salinas Valley, where they were specifically looking at how you could treat pollutant control from ag runoff, but inline as opposed to side to side. Yeah, we did. So the other reason why we didn't do a specific oh, yep, this is totally exactly how much it'll remove based on the habitat types or whatever, and based on the research, is that a lot of this is East Coast, and it's looking at lateral, and it's looking at removing, agriculture or other habitat types that aren't analogous to what we have in Southern California. So there was nothing that was really directly yep, this is what we need, and that's providing the exact thing we're talking about. So it gave us an idea of where things would land, but again, we wanted to be conservative, and we didn't want to say, this is where it is, we are confident, because we just don't have that degree of confidence. Okay. So to talk a little bit about the California Rapid Assessment Method, it looks at the landscape and buffer, as well as the biotic structure, the hydrology, and the biotic condition, the hydrology and the physical structure. So it's providing a quick snapshot. It only takes a couple hours to do, of what the condition of that feature is at the time. It is repeatable, and it also in terms of design of these projects, identifies where you're likely to be able to provide benefit by improving the condition. So those are the reasons that we used it. It also gives us a nice score out of 100 at the end. There's a lot of, in the CRAM community, there is conversation about how beneficial that the index score is in terms of what it shows you, and ultimately it doesn't, tell you a ton other than the general overall condition. But for the purposes of this program, we really needed to know the general overall condition as opposed to breaking it down into the metrics or attributes. Those are helpful in terms of design and in terms of a lot of other uses. But for this, we were looking at overall condition, what is the overall function. So based on the premise that higher condition resources are providing more of the functions and values that you would expect of that type and a higher quality of those functions and values. So that's important because when we get into the scoring and how we're using that CRAM index score in the calculation of the water quality equivalency, CRAM scores are based from 25 to 100 on the assumption that any wetland is better than no wetland in terms of functions and values. So you can't have a wetland with 0 score because it is doing something. And then when you're looking at the index score, a statistically supported difference in condition on the ground is a change in score of 7 points. So when we were looking at using this within our equation to identify that we're providing this additional habitat benefit, which is something that's allowed on top of the water quality benefit in the permit, so we're giving those extra scores, that extra value to these credits based on that condition improvement, as well as the basic assumption that these streams have functions and values that they're providing for water quality. And as you're improving the conditions of them, you would assume that those functions and values would be working better, those functions. So what we did is we looked at, to get that ecological condition factor, the so you have to survey before, your anticipated post score, based on the conditions that you are changing and how those would change the score of the stream after your restoration project. And then we divided it by 7 to give us the number of actual increases in physical condition we would expect based on that restoration. This is something that is validated after through the monitoring process as well to make sure we're actually meeting that condition target. So, and then again, what we were talking about with the vegetation, we used conservative percentages across the board for what we expected the removal to be, with the minimum being 0.19 and the maximum being 0.61. Those are actually ranges that come straight from the stormwater world for their BMP effectiveness, which is something else that we did to keep things consistent for those practitioners so that they were familiar with it. Also, we didn't want to be, in order to be conservative and for their comfort, we didn't want to be saying that this method was more effective than the methods that they've done lab testing on and are very confident in. So we were leaving this as a conservative efficacy. And then the ecological condition factor is a multiplier, and it can range from 1, which is no change in condition, or that's where you start off with for your pre, to a change in condition of, I believe it's 4 steps to get to a 3.2 multiplier. And that was, we capped that. First off, we didn't feel like, if you're taking those 4 different condition steps, that's great, but above that, are you really getting that? How much additional pollutant control benefit are you getting? Also, we didn't want people to game the system and say, yep, I'm gonna take it from a 25 super non-functioning stream to 100%. We looked at what was available in the area. We looked at the assessments that have been done in the region and the expected condition for our region, and said, this is where the low sites fit, this is where the high sites fit, our higher condition sites, and capped it within that range. Yeah.
I'm curious about how much involvement you had to have with the Corps when you did these sites, considering you're taking a single thread channel and making it into more of a wetlandy stream system?
So this program is being developed outside of the core. When the projects go through, they will interact with the core. And we're not necessarily looking at taking it from single thread to multiple, but we are looking at accessing that floodplain. So it may have that result, but that's not even a design criteria that we're looking at providing. Some of these streams, that is their native condition as well, because we are in the arid west, so you expect them to be moving around more. There's more sandy sediments, and that's where they were originally prior to being incised from the additional unseasonal flows and higher intensity of flows during rain events.
So then you're foreseeing that you would not convert for example, a single thread channel to something other than what it should be historically, unless you did have a conversation with the IRT regarding that, or do you have open?
So this does not need to be done in a banking situation under 404.
Right.
They can be done as projects. They would obviously need to be permitted by the Corps. They're being done in 404 resources.
Right.
But it doesn't need to be done in the banking situation. We did also put measures in to prevent type conversions like that. Like, we're not looking for somebody to come in and say, raise the stream level, and so you're then doing sheet flow across an entire area. Like, sure, that raises your inundation area, but it's going to tank the rest of your scores. So you won't get a high level of credit. So there are a couple checks and balances built into the equation to keep it as a functioning stream system. So what we're really, the goal is to improve the stream and riparian condition, not to just maximize the infiltration area. And so we tried to put as many checks in as possible to make sure that that's where it ended up. And there is also review not only by the regulatory agencies that are seeing this, all of these projects will need to get permitted by the Corps, the Water Board, and our Department of Fish and Wildlife, because they're all on stream. So there's 3 separate permitting processes that they will need to go through. So we, in addition to the checks and balances we've put in, we're anticipating that city review, as well as those agencies' reviews, will also make sure that we're not getting projects that are just gaming the system to try and get all the water quality credits they have. If somebody wants to do that, they can put in a basin. It'll be actually not cheaper, but a lot easier. Okay. So that's really the bulk of my presentation. In terms of where we are in the approval process, we've had a number of meetings with the regional board, as well as stakeholder meetings. We've reached out to the land development community, the stormwater community. Put in 3 rounds of review with our regional board. It was more than that informally, but those were the formal rounds where they reviewed everything. It's been formally submitted through the MS4 annual process and is in review. I have like 5 sentences left to write that they need to review, and then hopefully will be approved and the program can start being underway halfway through this year. Things are going well. They've been very supportive. They actually asked the city to develop this and have been a partner in all of it. So hopefully that works. We did also, something that I didn't include in this, but I wanted to mention, is we did a few different case studies, because one of the criteria that the regional board asked us to meet when we were developing this was not just to provide pollutant control credits through restoration, but was also to provide something that would be cost effective. So within the region, we want this to be successful, and a huge component of being successful is being cost effective for the people who are implementing it. So it's an incentive for developers to go to this type of program, whether they're developing their own project or using the city's in lieu fee. And what we found was that this is actually including all of the long-term maintenance and monitoring. So looking at design, planning, permitting, all of the costs that you would expect, as well as implementation, success monitoring, and long-term maintenance and monitoring in perpetuity, was substantially cost-effective compared to basins or other BMPs that are standardly used in the area, such as wetland vaults, other underground ways that created wetlands in the stormwater world compared to this. So again, I didn't include it, but the costs were very effective for this method. And we base those costs based on restoration projects that we've had in the area that do similar restoration, as well as what they've needed to be successful long term in perpetuity. There's some questions if we have a mic.
Oh, sorry.
I have a follow-up question for your finances. What is the service area, what are the conditions for where a restoration site would have to be compared to the impact site? I'm just thinking, this sounds awesome, but I can't imagine that the finances work out when you are like in downtown Tacoma or Seattle and Washington, and you have a stream and you need a few feet on the side of that urban stream. So
the credits need to be within the same sub-watershed. So it's essentially a HUC 12. It has a different name in the stormwater world that they call it. It's a sub-basin plan, but it's not the sub-basins like when you're looking at the HUC codes. So it's essentially your HUC 12, and it needs to be within that area, also within the city. So even though the HUC, this city has two plan areas. One's the Sweetwater watershed and one's the Otay. The Otay watershed actually goes substantially up. There's a reservoir right outside of the city and then has headwaters. Those areas are not included. You can't do credits there. When we were initially starting the program, we looked and said, okay, do we want to have projects be allowed outside of the city and provide credits for within the city? There was the administrative issue I mentioned before, but also we looked at it and we're like, okay, so we put this restoration project in the headwaters and then it goes into the reservoir, and that completely dampens any benefit. And we didn't feel like, that would be beneficial to the water quality. We felt it would not be, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be disingenuous of us to say we can put restoration up above the reservoir and provide water quality benefits for our receiving water body. Other things we had to consider, because this is stormwater, we had to consider 303D listing. Our receiving waters within the City of Chula Vista do not have 303D listing for these pollutants. They do have for trash, I think, which is addressed through that first flush, so the on-site treatment that's still required. The watersheds do flow into San Diego Bay, which does have a couple of TMDLs, but because it's one removed, we didn't need to consider them as part of the program. We also put in, as part of the program, adaptive management, to say, one thing that may need to be addressed is if you have TMDLs in the future, how do you address that, and can that be addressed through this program? It's, again, something that we didn't need to address at this point and had limited funding, so we didn't do too far beyond what our scope was.
Hi, Mike Burton with Black & Beach. So you talked about limited funding. What was the budget for the study and implementation of this program?
Total budget for consulting and the city was $625,000. $625,000 for development of the program. That does not include any project implementation. And so I'm not sure how many of you are from California or familiar with our rules. It also does not include CEQA. Because this is program level, does not direct any project being involved, and there was no approval required, formal approval required by the city. CEQA was not a requirement. We didn't have any of the triggers. So this program can be adopted. The way it's being adopted doesn't trigger any CEQA approval. That approval will need to be done by each project. Every project that falls under this for restoration will trigger CEQA, unless it's within, like, there's a small habitat restoration exemption, which they might fall under, but they will also need to go through the standard environmental permitting process, which luckily, there are programmatic processes in place, so we don't expect it to be a giant burden on the process, on the programs, but it is, we live in a very regulated world in California.
Hi, Rebecca. Mike Galvin, JMT. Two quick questions. You mentioned the long-term protections, and I guess could you maybe describe what the long-term protections and funding requirements might be for something like this? But also, I'm just curious how you guys ended up proposing 5 years of post-construction monitoring versus 7 or 10?
Yeah. So the site protections, we are defaulting to a conservation easement, but leaving that open to an instrument approved by the city and the permitting agencies if there are other options that want to be taken. The city in this area, so they have a lot of land management with a multi-species conservation plan. And most of those areas are under open space easement, which is different from a conservation easement in California. So both of those options are still perpetual in duration, but open space has a 5% allowance for development. So I've talked with my client at the city on how these areas really need to be under conservation. You can't put them in and then develop 5% of them later. So these are areas that will be under perpetual conservation. We are defaulting to conservation easement, but allowing for other options if it's under public ownership, as long as it's perpetual in duration and approved by both the city and the permitting agencies. For funding, we were looking at specifically for the amount of funding you would need for long term. We did look at specifically what you would need for this program. So even though these might be co-located with species or 404, we were not looking at the requirements for either of those programs. We were solely looking at the requirements for maintenance and monitoring to maintain the stream rehabilitation under this program. Any sort of endangered species issues, other additional 404 requirements, so if you have, there's a couple endangered species in the area, if you have protocol surveys you need, those costs were not included when we looked at what the cost for this would be, because they're not a component of this program. They would be done separately in addition to, if other credits are being provided by the same area or within the same bank. And then in terms of the duration that we looked at, so I was actually talking to a colleague who used to work in California a lot and still does, on how that's our standard is 5 years. Like that's what we say. A lot of times the monitoring period does go longer, either in permit or in effect, but the standard that's proposed is 5 years, especially in climate change, and depending on how the success criteria are written. I know of projects that have gone on for substantially longer without being signed off, but that is what we propose and what we put in as a minimum, with the understanding and based on consultation with the board that their stormwater program didn't want to dictate that. Their stormwater program wanted that to be dictated by the 401 permit as opposed to through this program. So that's the baseline for this, with the expectation that it may go longer. And looking at the credit release schedule, those credits will only be released as success is met for how it's proposed for the projects. Yeah.
In the earlier part of the presentation, there was a reference to legacy sediment. Can you give an idea what you mean by that?
So that's really tied to, the 100+ years of development that's occurred in the area that did not have the requirement to treat their stormwater before it left the site. So there was additional hydromultiplication, additional just urban drool and runoff that has happened that has caused some pretty impressive effects to the sediment within the system. So a lot of erosion, and we're looking as a portion of this program to really try and remediate those effects, and to, as much as the program is used, be able to get rid of that incision and have creeks that aren't incised, that are able to regularly access their floodplain, provide those additional habitat and water quality benefits. Did that answer?
I'm curious of the performance standards. Are they, I saw the sediment, the vegetation, what was the third parameter?
Inundation.
Inundation. So give me an idea of what that looks like in a monitoring report that you intend to expect to see.
Yeah, so that would look like, for inundation, it's really going to be, does the design match the reality? So when you design the project, where you anticipated your inundation area to be, is that really kind of where it's going? So
that like bank full will help, cross sections will help,
yeah,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, probably more cross sections than anything else, because it will go outside of your. It has the potential to go outside of your bank full area. Because so that flow, the 85th percentile, is actually like slightly less than 1 year. So it should be either right around bankful or where it's just kind of going over. And
what about sediment? How will you measure that performance standard?
looking for erosion.
Okay.
And so whether or not it's actually preventing sediment from going on site. One thing that this program doesn't include is it doesn't have specific water quality monitoring requirements after each project. And that was, we're looking at, there is regional monitoring that's happening. And so that is, no one wanted to change the water quality monitoring that was happening based on this program. And we're also not expecting, we're not sure how much the program will be used. It's all driven by need and by want of use. But there's not an additional water quality requirement. There are a couple things, so two things I didn't mention. There are add-on credits that can be included in this. One of those is for benthic macroinvertebrate surveys under our California Swamp Protocol. The other is if you are preserving the buffer. And then there's, depending on how many surveys you do or the amount of buffer you preserve, and if you restore it, you get additional multipliers. They're both very small percentage-wise, but to incentivize preserving those areas. But really we're looking at, for those things, we're looking at conditions, so going out and saying, yes, we've removed areas of mass wasting, we're removing areas of severe erosion, and then for the biological condition monitoring, we're really looking at using CRAM for that, because that does look at the overall vegetation as well as the other structures. And so in a lot of ways, CRAM will identify, with how the method works, it will identify a lot of those conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Another follow-up regarding water quality. So pollutant removal efficiency is something you hope to get at through existing monitoring through CRAM. So I'm not very familiar with that. So do you have specific pollutants of concern in that area that you're interested in monitoring whether there's a change? So where I'm coming from is Washington State. We have 6 ppd quinone that causes pre-spawn mortality in coho. So we're all looking at what to do with that. So I was wondering, are there things like that you're looking for, hoping to address and pick up?
So CRAM won't actually do water quality monitoring. It does condition of the feature, but there is regional water quality monitoring that's done. And so that's where, ideally if this program is used, we'll see a benefit in the region. One of the things that is a requirement under this program is addressing greater watershed benefits. And so we're looking at how it affects the greater watershed in addition to the site-specific. And then for the pollutants that we're looking at for the typical pollutants in the area. So, for vegetation, we're looking at, what was the types, nitrogen, phosphorus, and I'm trying to remember what the one that was in the third. Yeah, total dissolved solids or suspended solids. But those aren't the only pollutants that we're considering. So we're really looking at the typical pollutants, and that's based on what is anticipated to be coming through from the land use factor. So it does include other things. We, didn't address, we didn't address like heavy metals or oils, which should be, like the oils should be caught in the first flush. So we kept it very loose at typical in the area as opposed to targeting specific pollutants. Which I don't know if that's satisfying, but that's the answer. And I have no idea where I am on time, but if there's no more questions, I think that's it. So, and again, this was our team. I only put my contact information up here because no one else is speaking, but Rick Engineering was the consultant, the engineering consultant helping us, and we're working for the City of Chula Vista. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions.